Good afternoon. I'm Maria Angulo, marketer and publicist at Angulo Marketing. I've worked closely with Connie in promoting her book, Cavalier, and I'm honored to welcome you to her online book launch. North Dakota was home to Connie Nelson for most of her career in marketing and communications. After retiring in 2018 and moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico, she became active in local writing and publishing circles, which led her to writing her first book, Cavalier, the story of an unsolved murder in a small town. The true crime memoir centers on the true story of Connie's friend, Dr. Jack Wall, who was murdered in his home one night in 1986. Nearly 35 years later, the COVID pandemic provided the time to research and participate in online workshops to hone her writing and publishing skills. So as the world stood still for a couple of years, Connie utilized her downtime to write her story, resulting in an intimate and oftentimes startling portrait of America's flawed justice system and how it affects everyday people. Jack's unsolved murder impacted her life, along with the lives of many others, including, of course, his family. She hopes that her book will help raise awareness about the many murder investigations that reach a dead end, take years to solve, or go cold, leaving friends and family wondering what happened and why. Before we go on and let Connie start her presentation, I just want to let you know that as she's speaking, if some questions come up for you, feel free to type them in the chat. And what we'll do for the Q&A is we'll go back and make sure that we catch anyone who asks questions in the chat first.
Oh, they're my friends. So nice to see everybody. Very nice. Thank you for coming. Thanks for coming to talk about my book. I'm very relieved to have finally finished it, of course, after all these years thinking about it. To date, over 900 people have purchased the book, which is overwhelming, and I just never expected that. So thank you, everybody who bought books. One of the things, we could talk about this later too, but if you want to do something to help, write a review on Amazon or ask your local bookstore to carry it. They should have it listed in their directory now to be able to order it. So that's how we'll get the word out. This topic is so timely right now because of social media. But I want everyone to remember, this is just my story. It's how I felt because of losing a friend like this and not having a solution. So, you know, there's lots of people like me in the country today. And I've called the book a true crime memoir because it's really what happened to me, how I felt, how sad I was, and how it affected my life. And those of you that aren't familiar with Cavalier, it's located in the northeast corner of North Dakota, an hour from Winnipeg and 85 miles from Grand Forks. So it's way up north and it's remote. And that's part of the setting for my book. So that's important. I based the book on 3 primary sources. I had kept everything in a box, correspondence from different people, all the newspaper articles, and from 1986. And then in October of 2020, James Molnar actually helped me file a Freedom of Information request to the state's attorney in Pembina County and asked to review the investigation notes. And in North Dakota, anyone can ask to review notes like that for stories they're working on. And they have to give a good reason if they're not going to share it with you. I also wanted people to know that there's no universal definition of a cold case. Jack's case is considered open and inactive, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the U.S. Institute of Justice defines cold case as a case such as a violent crime, missing person or unidentified person that has remained solved for at least 3 years and has the potential to be solved through newly acquired information or advanced technology. North Dakota's definition of a cold case, and this was put into law in 2005 under Wayne Stenjum, the Attorney General. The definition is an unsolved criminal investigation that is no longer being actively pursued due to lack of evidence. There is no statute of limitations, but the perpetrator must be alive to be charged. So, and actually there's a really good website on the North Dakota Attorney General's site under cold cases. The state of Virginia just announced a new cold case searchable database. And under that state's definition of a cold case, they say that it's one that has been unsolved for at least 5 years after the crime occurred, a person went missing, or an unidentified body was found, whichever occurred last. Cold cases are most likely to be reopened. And on page 187, if you want to jot this down in the book, there's a ranked order list of when cold cases are most likely to be opened. And the top one is new witness information. Availability of DNA is next. Information from citizens or informants. And it goes on from there. So you can see the whole list if you go to page 187 in the book. Then I just want to paint the picture of really how many cases there are like this. Between 1980 and 2019, there were 508 murders in North Dakota. That was shocking to me. 424 have been solved and 84 are still open or cold. There were 10 murders in North Dakota in 1986, the year my friend Jack was murdered. And there were 26 murders in North Dakota in 2019. So almost 3 times as many. Of course, the state grew during that time too because of oil. And by 2020, there were 32 murders committed in North Dakota. 4 out of 10 murders in the United States are never solved. And as of December 2019, Jack's murder is one of 269,205 unsolved murders in the United States. Approximately 6,000 new cases are added to that every year. And I say in the book, when you know somebody that's included in that data, it's much more meaningful. The murderers have more rights than the victim. The murderers have 5 layers of appeal in federal crimes, like Alphonse Rodriguez, which is often in the news in North Dakota. And there are 9 layers of appeal for state crimes. Of course, the victims have no recourse. They have no appeal. So as I began to put my thoughts on paper, I began to think of why something needed to happen with this case. It basically had been sitting on a shelf in the sheriff's office in Cavalier since December 1986, when Glenn Wells retired as the sheriff. So I started looking at it from all the different people's point of view that would be affected by the case. Of course, Jack's family should know who, if they knew the murderer or not. Was it a friend? Was it someone that's still around that had a relationship with their son and brother? Poor John Nelson's family. For 36 years now, they've been under a cloud of doubt. Everybody wondering, did John really do it? He didn't claim responsibility in his suicide note, which some people think is odd, but he was the last person to see Jack alive. Most people would want to confess or clear their conscience before they shot themselves, but John Nelson did not. He was 23 years old. I did not know him. He was in the bar, Stu's Pub, the night of the murder, but he and Jack were not together. Jack came in after he'd been out for dinner, sat at the bar, had a drink, talked to another guy, and left. And no one saw them together. And that's through the investigation notes that I learned that. The investigators had said nothing was missing from his home. And they went through with the housekeeper, and she didn't see anything that was out of place. But when I met with the sheriff and the deputy last summer, they told me that there was something missing, Jack's Concordia College ring, which he always wore. And that was absolutely shocking to me, because the person that I always thought might have had means, motive, and opportunity was a friend from Concordia. It's not fair that the murderer has had 36 more years to live. Jack would have been 80 in June this year. So he's missed a lot. He was gone at age 43. No one is held accountable, and that person could be living among us. We don't know. The citizens of the community of Cavalier and Pembina County need closure too. After there's been a murder in a town where everybody knows each other, how do you go back to feeling safe again? Do they still worry when they see strangers in town, or do they lock their doors? Since my book was published, I've gotten lots of texts and emails from the kids that lived in the neighborhood between Jack's house and mine. And they're in their 40s now. And they wrote to me saying things like, I've never been so scared in my life. I was just a little kid. I'll never forget that day. I wondered if it was a serial killer, and on like that. And I had never, ever thought of those kids and how it might have impacted them. The other thing I've heard from people in that region is there's all they know is rumor and innuendo, because there weren't good media reports. There's been no follow-up since December of 1986. So they were just grateful that someone had written the story down, so they had somewhere to go and some frame of reference, rather than depending on the community gossip. Jack's friends and family certainly need to know whether Jack's social life played a role in his demise. I really am uncomfortable with the idea that 36 years later, there's that cloud hanging over, that Jack let strangers into his house, Jack partied too much, or whatever they were thinking. And I hate that that's his legacy. He was such a good doctor. He was such a good friend, that I just hate that idea. So it kind of it makes me feel like Jack is responsible for his own death, the way people talk about it. And I just want to scream, no, he was a victim. Look at it, from that standpoint. The investigators thought that the murder might have some familiarity with where the vital organs were located in the body. And they considered that maybe a doctor or someone who was a veteran. There was always this cloud of, was he really homosexual? Was he gay? Was it a gay rage kind of thing? Kari, his ex-wife, was the one that told everyone that Jack was gay when they were getting divorced, and that hung around as a cloud forever. And going back to John Nelson, I never heard that he was gay. I didn't know him, and I never heard that he was a veteran. So I don't know exactly why the focus stayed on John Nelson. I feel bad for his family. So when people ask me why I did this, I'll just give you a little background. When I moved to Santa Fe in 2018, I had torn my meniscus in my knee and needed knee surgery. And after my surgery in November of 18, I started going to the local therapy pool. It's just wonderful. It's about a mile from my house, and it's a warm water pool with jets, and you can do stretches and rehab in it. And I still go there today. And the first two friends that I made in Santa Fe, I made in that pool, Sandy and Jared. And I asked them what they did for fun and entertainment now that they were retired. They were both teachers. And they both said, well, we're writers. One writes children's books and another one focuses on photography. And I said, oh, I have a book in my head. And they said, well, we'll help you. And they brought me to their writers group, and the rest is basically history. Last month, when our group had their monthly meeting and the president announced that my book had finally been published, they were like proud parents, the whole group. It was the best feeling. So because of my knee, I lucked out and met these wonderful people. They're publishers. I met Mari there. Publishers, writers, editors, everything you could possibly need right here in Santa Fe. It's just been wonderful. So I feel really fortunate about that. But I used the Maya Angelou quote. She had said, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And when I saw that, I thought, that's how it feels. That's what it feels like, that I have an untold story. And since there hadn't been any follow-up reports since December of 1986, I kind of took it on as a mission. I thought that law enforcement was totally myopic. If you've read the book, you probably picked that up right away. And I learned that law enforcement sets a scenario and then tries to stack up the evidence to fit the scenario. They aren't open-minded. They're not looking at everything. One of the things that really got to me was a lot of people in the investigation notes had said, I don't know the answer to that, but Connie would know. And they never talked to me. And I always felt bad about that. I did approach Sonny Dump, the BCI investigator, a couple weeks after the murder to tell him that Dr. Watkin and Dr. Wall had been fighting, and my brother-in-law was involved in this discussion, and Dr. Watkin had come to my office and threatened me and was threatening Jack and all that. And I thought that might be important to the investigation. I did meet with Sonny and I told him my story, and I never heard from them again either. Not that I think Dr. Watkin was the murderer, but I just thought, wouldn't you want to follow up on every clue that you got? It's kind of like they saw a tennis shoe print in Jack's garage, and they never did anything with it. They never identified whose tennis shoe that was. And people ask me, why did Jack mean so much to you? Well, the Gregory family that I married into is very dysfunctional. And Jack was like part of the family. He was always in all the events, activities that the Gregory family had. And he kind of right away took me under his wing like a big brother. And I say in the book, he had 3 sisters and I had 3 brothers. So it was very natural to have him as a good friend. So he was kind of a protector of mine. And it was very nice to have him. He was an outsider to the community too. He wasn't originally from there. So he didn't have, generations of family in the community to support him either, and neither did I. So we kind of had that in common. People have asked me, why did I use the characters' real names? I started out with the idea, in fact, I have a whole list of the new names I assigned to everybody. But when I started writing, it was more like a memoir. and it didn't make sense without giving the background of my marriage and how much Jack meant to me, and what the small town atmosphere was like. And people would have known if I called Jack Wilson, as I had intended, they'd still know who it was there. So it just seemed to make more sense to use everybody's actual names. And people have asked me too, do I expect to solve the case with my book? No, I expect people, I expect people to talk about it again and think about any ideas that they might have had to try to close the case. There really isn't anything for DNA, photos, even the cameras the police use to take pictures of the crime scene were such a different system then as now. You wouldn't even be able to reproduce anything that looks the same. And I tried to paint the picture of in the context of time. In 1986, we didn't have 911, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have fingerprint analysis, we didn't have DNA, we didn't have no CODIS, no APIS. It was a different time and place. And so none of the evidence was kept from the site for future, because no one even thought that way. It just wasn't even anything that was invented yet. So there are resources now. I think there are things that the state could do to make things better. I think this idea of allowing the extended family to get updates on anything they've learned or anything that hasn't worked out the way they thought. I think that there will be more sharing of information across state lines and jurisdictions, because we can. It's so easy now to just share things electronically. I looked up Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers started in Albuquerque, so that's why it piqued my interest. And I looked up, and there's no North Dakota Crime Stoppers group. And Crime Stoppers, offers rewards for people that provide information that end up in an arrest. And I think some of the cities might have a Crime Stoppers program, but the state as a whole does not. So that would be a recommendation. And then in Alaska and some of the other states, they're doing things now like when someone is arrested, they take a DNA sample and it goes into the database. It doesn't matter if they were convicted. And Susan is an attorney, so she might be able to tell us some of the issues with that. But and in other states, if someone is convicted, their DNA is kept, and that'll help. There's a lot of controversy about genealogy and the sharing of DNA databases like 23andMe and some of those. And if you are involved in that yourself, make sure that you look at the section that says, can this be shared with law enforcement? Because you may or may not want to do that. And the other thing with that those DNA databases is they can trace your family. So they could go back to my 3 generations and find out if there was someone 50 years ago that did something in my family. I don't think North Dakota has thought about that. I don't think they have laws either protecting or allowing that. And then with technology the way it is, just carrying your cell phone can be unlawful search and seizure, because if your cell phone was in the vicinity of a crime, now they can find out that you were there and follow up and talk to you. So I think all these new things that are coming along to help solve cases may or may not ever help to solve this case. But I think we might need to change some things in order for future cases. And my hope is that writing my book will trigger something with someone, and maybe someone on their deathbed will say, hey, I did it, and we can have closure. But I don't expect my book to make a difference in solving the case. I think it'll help generate some interest, and maybe someone will come out of the woodwork and we'll know. I just want to say one other thing. This idea that John Nelson was the murderer, one of the reasons that the police really focused on him was his friend Dean Becker, who I didn't know to be a very responsible character. John Nelson killed himself on March 11, 1986, and Dean Becker went to the police on March 20th, and they were friends. They grew up together, actually. And Dean Becker shared a story with the sheriff that perfectly matched the scenario that the sheriff had come up with. And so that's all they pursued. And like I said, Dean wasn't exactly a reliable character, and his friend was dead, and he framed him, basically. And that doesn't seem right to me either. And people in Cavalier vacillate back and forth and say, well, maybe Dean Becker did it. Well, there's nothing that shows that Dean Becker was in the vicinity or nearby. He wasn't in the bar with all the people that were that night or anything. So I don't know. But I feel bad for the Nelson family again, because it's just hanging out there. Did their son do it or didn't he? That's all we know after 36 years. So with that, do we have questions?
Connie, has there been any repercussions on using real names?
In the book?
Uh-huh.
A few people have said that they thought I was a little hard on my ex-husband.
Oh.
And my answer to that is, if you think about it, when you read the book, I was a little hard on myself equally, I think. I mean, I talked about drinking too much and some of the things I did. And I certainly could have told a lot more stories. So I felt like by also pointing out the things that I did wrong, you know, and I ended up getting divorced. I just couldn't live there anymore, you know, which was traumatic for my kids. I mean, I'm no saint either, but a lot of most of the comments I've heard is people say, aren't you a little hard on this ex-husband? So sorry about that, but it was part of the story. You know, if I didn't tell that part, people wouldn't understand how Jack and I got to be such good friends and how he was protecting me all the time, because they just didn't treat women very well. So
yeah, that makes sense.
James, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sorry, Susan, you were next, but I'll grab it here. What did I write? I was just wondering what your biggest challenge was with writing the book. And now that you have that awesome thing called hindsight that we never have when we need it, what would you do differently, or what would you recommend someone else? Like, what mistakes have you learned from or anything?
I have mostly learned positive things. I've let me think of a good example. Like, here's a positive. I'm very happy that I contacted the state's attorney, and she let me speak with the deputy and the sheriff. That really was life-changing, hearing their side of it, even though they weren't involved in the investigation, but they knew all the law enforcement background. That was very good. I wish there were other people that I would have seen that had means, motive, and opportunity, so that I could talk about other possibilities.
Mhm.
I just found one that I thought fit that criteria, the means, motive, and opportunity. I would rewrite the whole thing, of course. You know, writers are wordsmithing constantly. So, you know, I would
I hear ya.
change things like that. That's one thing I learned. And I had an editor, you know, but still, it sounds like I talk, I think. And I hate that. So, whatever.
Connie,
Hi,
good to see
hi,
you.
Suzanne. Yeah.
I'm just wondering now, having researched and written this book, has that changed or helped you deal with the emotional trauma and the agony that you've gone through over all these years?
I think so. The people here, my friends in Santa Fe, have said it was so personal. You told so much. And I said, well, that was sort of the point. That's how it started. It was my therapy. I just wanted to get it out there. I've been, you know, wondering these things and holding it inside for so long. That I hope that was a good thing to do. We'll see, I guess. I think, put myself out there and said, here, this is how I felt. This is what happened. I wish it could have been different, you know.
Have other family members or relatives or friends told you that the book has helped them as well?
I haven't talked to anyone, but Bob Lee, who was the state's attorney in Pembina County during the case, has retired and moved to Washington State, and I tracked him down at the beginning, and I said, Bob, I'm writing a book about the Wall murder, and he said, I don't want anything to do with it. But he was the first person to send me a text and say, you did it, congratulations, I can't wait to read it. So, you know, it might even help him. You know, a lot of people held him responsible because he was supposed to be in charge of the investigation, and he never filed media reports. Everybody just had to wonder. Susan Stibbe, did you live in Cavalier then?
Yes, Connie, I'm Susan Timian Stibbe.
Right.
So I grew
And
up
so
in the neighborhood.
I didn't know if you were still living there at that time,
No.
or if you were in.
No, I had gotten married in 1978, but you know, my parents
Oh,
were there.
okay. Yeah.
So, but my question, and Dad is still living. So he
Oh,
is
okay.
also reading a copy of your book.
Okay.
But my question was, did you think the media coverage, those of us that weren't living there at the time, of course, I had my mother to talk to, but did you feel the media coverage was not very accurate?
Yeah. I mean, well, I don't know if accurate is the right word. I think
Biased?
they were kind of sensationalizing things. And the more interesting the stories were, the more the media reported. And that's one of the reasons I put the letters to the editor in the back of the book, because you can see that people were outraged, you know, like I talked about Jack's legacy. Well, you know, is that he didn't deserve that legacy of people saying, well, he partied too much or whatever. I partied too much, you know. I just felt that it was important to put those letters in there so you could get a feel for what the community was up against. And it wasn't the Cavalier Chronicle, it was the Grand Forks Herald, pretty much, that was doing that.
They maybe at the time were so unused to covering something like this in a small town. I mean, it was, yeah, because I remember reading all of the original reports.
Yeah, and that's why Dr. Rasmussen and I had a meeting with the Grand Forks Herald, because we wanted to talk about Jack as a person. You know, I said, you know, Jack had people after the bars closed, Jack would have people come to his house because he was lonely. You know, he lived alone in that big house, and he didn't like being alone. And other people see it as some sinister motive. But again, you have to remember, in a small town too, there was no 24-hour restaurant to go to. You had to go to someone's house. There wasn't, and he was single and he liked people. I think people took advantage of him with that too.
There is another question actually from Susan Ellison. Susan, if you want
Okay.
to go ahead.
I guess I was wondering who had determined that the perpetrator may have known where the major organs were located, and wouldn't that have ruled out John Nelson, the 23-year-old?
Well, that's what I said is, I don't know that he had a background, I don't know him at all though. So I don't know that he had a background, but you know, he was stabbed in all the vital organs. So someone who knew anatomy or knew how to kill probably did it. Someone who had been trained. And yes, when they moved the body to send it to for the what's it called, the post-mortem, or the what's that called, the
Autopsy.
autopsy. When they did that, you know, it was obvious that he was stabbed in all the vital organs. So it appeared that whoever did it knew something about anatomy or the body, or knew how to kill.
Do you have any advice for someone who wants to write a book?
Do I? Yes. Join a group like I was able to do. I mean, if I want a publishing question or an editing question or a writing question, I knew people because I was part of this writers group. I was so fortunate to fall into that when I moved to Santa Fe. So you have to surround yourself with the people that actually also do that. I learned everything from them. And then partially because of COVID and partially because of my writers group, there were so many Zoom training opportunities during COVID. And I almost every day participated in something. And that's how I learned about KDP, which is Kindle Direct Publishing, and Ingram Spark, who that's the company that prints my book on demand. I learned from the workshops with my writers group about self-publishing. You know, most people would think, well, I have to be with one of those big publishers. Well, the reality is there aren't very many left. I think as of this fall, there'll be 4, and they're all part of a bigger conglomerate, you know, like those multimedia groups. So self-publishing is the way to go. You have control. I get great reports every day from KDP, from Kindle Direct Publishing, and Kindle Direct Publishing is owned by Amazon. And so that's how my book went to Amazon. And we had control all the way through of where we wanted it to go. Now, the next stage is Ingram Spark is also a distribution company. And what I've learned is that all libraries and bookstores, whether they're private ones or not, order their books through a directory. And most of them order through Ingram Spark. So my book, they said it would take 2 to 6 weeks to have my book listed in the directory. So then my book goes in the directory, and if people ask for it, even in Barnes and Noble or anywhere, they ask for my book, they can look on their directory and see if they have access to it. I did that the other day. I went to Collected Works in Santa Fe, my favorite bookstore. And I asked if my book was in the Ingram Spark directory yet, and they looked it up and said yes, and there's 60 books in the warehouse. So it's a great system. And last night I learned that now I'm an international author because there was one book ordered in Canada. So
Good.
my husband got a kick out of that. I said, I'm an international author now. So, but that makes sense because of the proximity, you know, and people would be familiar. But I was surprised to see it. But Ingram Spark, I check little boxes of which countries I'm willing to sell my book in. And then there's a different royalty amount that you get depending on what the country is and the exchange and all that. And then through my writers group, I met Mari and her group, and like she said, she's in Spain. So the only problem that we have is that she's 8 hours different in time. So it's like midnight for her now that we're talking. And so we have to work on, you know, timing things that way. But just think about it. Janet, her sister, did the drawing for the cover in South Korea. And Mari has done my website, and Angeline, is she still here? Anyway, Angeline and Mari send out the email notices and keep me on my toes. So we keep moving. So I have a great agency, and I would recommend, you know, doing that. I also have an attorney in Albuquerque who specializes in intellectual property. And it's great to have her. And just a sidebar, she's from the Ukraine. So it is a very international project here, but you know, it's seamless. You know, Mari sends me an email and I answer it right away. So, I mean, you don't notice any difference. Before COVID, some of the people in the writers group were doing things like printing in China or Korea because it was cheaper, or Canada, other places. Well, to me, the easiest was self-publishing through Ingram Spark, and then using KDP for distribution. So I don't want to be out in my garage putting books in envelopes and mailing out, going to the post office every day. You know, so there's lots of great efficiencies once you know the system and what's going on. Mari, can you add anything to that with the writers group?
Well, I think it's good to have community in anything that you do. It's really helpful to have support. So I'm right there with you that we went through a bizarre time. You know, we all did in our own little bubbles, online and in person. And I think it was a unique situation, you know, that you were able to not only write your book and have the support that you needed with that, with an editor, but with getting your book up and also marketing it and distributing it.
Right.
I think it takes a village. And in this case, it's not such a small village. It's a very international team of people.
Yeah.
But anybody can
I
do
should-
it. I think that's the message. Anybody can really do it.
Yeah.
At this point.
I should, just a minute, let me grab this if I can. It should be right here. We shouldn't forget Mary Neighbor. You see it? It looks blurry when I hold it out.
I know, it's because the camera is focused
Doesn't
on
work.
your face.
Well, Mary Neighbor is one of the people that's in my writers group. And during the time before COVID, she had written this book, Self-Publishing, Wizard or Wannabe. And I'd recommend that. Mary was my book shepherd, it's called. Mary helped me all the way through, find answers, you know, learn things. The day that we sent the book for publishing, she actually pressed the button because she'd been the one that attached it to the website and everything. So, and I'd never heard of a book shepherd before I got involved in the writers group. And I remember a meeting at the beginning, and I was new and I didn't know anybody or anything. And they were going around the room introducing themselves and saying, I'm a ghostwriter, I do audiobooks, I do podcasts, or whatever it is. And I said, well, I'm retired and I used to be a grant writer, and I'm thinking about writing a book. And they nudged me and said, no, just say you're an author. So, you know, I had so many people like that just standing behind me, helping. And I'd recommend that to anybody. I'm sure there are writers groups like mine everywhere and online. So, but it took a long time. You know, I learned a lot. I spent a lot of time, you know, in workshops and talking to people. The other thing about technology and having no fear is when I see something I like, I can just fire off an email and ask questions, and I get answers right away. It's been wonderful. And that's how I originally met James. He does podcasts, Dakota Spotlight podcasts, on murdered and missing people. And when I heard about that, I just looked him up, sent an email and said, I hope you're not doing my story. I'm writing a book. He said, no, you can do that. I've got other projects. So, and then we've been in touch ever since. And he wrote one of the reviews on my book cover. So I've met lots of people that way. You just can't have any fear, you know, you have to just go out there and talk to people. And one of the quotes in the front of the book too, or it's on my website, I believe, about the a story grows cold, or a case grows cold when the story stops being told. When I saw that, I thought, well, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm saying too. So I just fired off an email and asked him if I could use it and attribute it. Oh yeah, no problem. So, you know, it's a great community of people. They share. So I encourage everyone.
I'm going to drop some links here and we'll send a follow-up email to everyone as well for the book. You've probably already seen, you know, where you can get the book and all of that. Connie does have a website, so you can get more information and updates from her there. If you want to buy it online, you can buy it on Amazon. You can also order it at your local bookstore. We actually encourage that you order it from your local bookstore because then you're supporting, you know, your local economy.
And I am doing an interview tomorrow with Kevin Wallivan on WDAY and with KNDK radio in Langdon. And those eventually will be linked to the website too. And there's already one interview there with Prairie Public TV, or radio, I guess, the Main Street program. So we'll try to do that. Anything we do, we'll add there and you can learn from it. You know, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well,
Anything
thank you all
else?
so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Fran.
Congratulations.
Very nice. Yeah, thank you.